Boker Tov. Today's daf yomi is Nedarim Chav Zayin, Nedarim 27. So we're going to complete the sugya we've been discussing from daf Chavav, and the sugya there discusses a person who had been taken a vow because he saw that everybody was eating figs, and he said, everybody who's eating those figs is prohibited to me from Hana, but then he comes closer and he sees that his father and brother, or his father or brother, Mishnah says father and brother, but it seems in the Gemara it's very clear, it's just one is required. And he says, oh, everybody, if I had known, everybody except for them. And under those circumstances, the vow is annulled, but there's a dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says the vow is annulled only with respect to the father and the brother, but not with respect to everybody else. Whereas Beis Hillel says the vow is annulled with respect to everyone. And the Gemara assumes that Beis Hillel and Rabbi Akiva are saying basically the same thing, because Rabbi Akiva says later on in our Masechta, the concept of Neder shehuter mitzasa huter kula. If you have a vow that's completely annulled, the whole vow is annulled. And that's what's going on here, and that's why Beis Hillel says the whole vow is annulled. What's the exact scenario that we're talking about? So about this, there's a dispute between Rabbah and Rava. Rabbah says that in the case of Mamid, in the case where he says, he repeats the language he used the first time, he says, Kulam Asurim, but then he just adds on Chutz, Me'abba, except for father. Then really, Beis Hillel, it would be in agreement with Beis Shammai that the vow would be applicable to everybody except to the father, because he's repeating, he's mamid the first words. But in the case of Mishuna, where he changes the words, that's where there's a dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel says the whole vow is annulled, and Beis Shammai says just a portion of the vow is annulled. Whereas comes along Rava, and Rava says, no, the machlokas is in a case of mamid. In a case of Mishuna, everybody would say, Neder shuter mitzasa hutar kulo, even Beis Shammai. But in the case where he's mamid, that's where Beis Hillel says the whole vow is annulled, and Beis Shammai says just a portion of the vow is annulled. So now on our daf, around 10 lines from the top, Rabbi Akiva, the Gemara says, Mantan lahadetanu Rabbanan, who is the author of the following brisa? And this is basically just a summary, where we say Nadar michamisha b'nei Adam. If a person takes a vow from five different people, ke'echad, he vows all these five people at once from him. Hutar la'echad mehem hutru kulan. If he makes a vow, if he releases one of them, he releases all of them. Hutru kulan. But if he says chutz me'echad mehem hu mutar ve'ein asurim, and if he says with the exception of one of them, then he's permitted and all the others are prohibited. And as the Ran explains, the Gemara's assumption is that the first case here is a case of Mishuna. Then the first case it was Mishuna, and so whereas the second case is a case of Mamid. So the Gemara says, okay, so let's just plug in the different shitos as we discussed. Ila Rabba, according to Rabba, Reisha Rabbi Akiva, that what does Rabbi Akiva say in a case of Mishuna? He says in a case of Mishuna that everybody is permitted, and let's look back here. That's exactly what Rabbi Akiva says. In a case where it's Mishuna, where he changes the language, and Rabbi Akiva says all of them are now released from the vow. And v'seifa divrei hakol, and in the latter case where he says, what is the latter case here? He says humutar chutz me'echad mehem humutar ve'ein asurim, that the vow remains for the other people. That's what everybody says in the case of Mamid. According to Rabbi Akiva, everybody remain. The vow is only partially prohibited. Where Ila Rava is just the opposite. According to Rava, we're going to say Reisha Rabbi Akiva. Ila Rava Seifa Rabbanan. According to Rava, Rava says in the case of Mishuna, even the Rabbanan would say that. According to Rava, in the case of Mamid, he says that that's where the machlokas is. The machlokas is by Mamid. That by Mamid, the Rabbanan say, Hutar echad mehen, hutar miktsas, whereas Rabbi Kiva says hutar kulan. So that's why Rava says Hil Rava Seifa, which is the case of Mamid, and we're saying the Seifa that only part of them are permitted. That's the sheet of the Rabbanan. The Reisha, but the Reisha, which is the case of Meshuna, there, according to Rava, everybody says that you're released from the vow. So therefore, he says it's Divrei. It's according to everybody. Okay, so now we go on to the next Mishnah. This chapter began by talking about the Arba Nedarim, the 4 types of vows. And indeed, we said that the 4 types of vows were the Nidre, is the ruzin, the vows of encouraging, the Nidre Havai, the vows of exaggeration, the vows of encouraging, the vows of exaggeration, the Nidre Shkagos, the accidental vows where you weren't sure what you said, or something happened accidentally, or Nidre Onsin. And an Ones is the last type of vow. These are vows that you don't even need to be annulled. They're automatically annulled. You don't even need to go to a Chacham. And an Ones is something that, an unforeseeable event, could not have expected it, that occurs, and we're saying that as a result of it, it's not applicable. So what's an example of a Nidre Onsin? Says our Mishnah, Idiru Chaver Sheyochel Etzlo. You made a vow that your friend should eat with him. Remember, we had discussed this earlier in our Gemara that we're talking about a case where the person who wants to be invited, I don't know if you remember this, but hopefully if you don't, you'll review it. But I'm sure you do remember it, that the Gemara wants somebody to invite him. And he says, invite me to your house. He says, okay, fine. He says, take an oath that I'm prohibited to have benefit from you if there were mudar anah. And so he takes an oath that he's invited to his home, that he has to come to his home. So he makes a vow to his friend should eat with him. But then the person who was invited himself, got sick, or his son got sick, or the river stopped it from coming. These are all onsin. These are what's called nidre onsin. These are vows, as the Ran explained, shelo al da'ato, as certain chasav al chavero, im lo yochel imo el k'sheyuchal avo below ones, klav or yavo. So because he didn't intend to prohibit his possessions on his friend, if he wouldn't come and eat with him, only when he was able to come without an onus, and without any onus, and he didn't come. But if he's kol shenenas k'tzas, but if he has a little bit of an onus, kigon shechol beno, like his son got sick and he needs to watch him, then it's permitted, because that was not the case of the vow. But the Ram makes a very important point here. This is not like a tremendous accident. He's sick. He has a cold. Who knows? He's not. It's just called an ones kitzas, and it's not even him. His son got sick. This is like the type of excuse you give to your teacher when you didn't hand in your homework. This is not like a tremendous ones. This is just a little bit of an ones, but that's still enough. So now the Gemara discusses this concept of ones. Says the Gemara, Gavra, there was a certain person, the itfis zachvasei, the beidina. There's a certain person where he gave basically his notes. He has these promissory notes. He gave them over to the court. And he says, if I don't come in the next 30 days, then these notes are nullified. So what's the case that we're talking about here? Again, we turn to the Ran. The Ran fills in all the gaps. We're so grateful to the Ran. Hi Gavra, says the Ran. This person, what's going on here is Bikesh Bezdin. He requested from the court, Sheyitnu lo zman. He requested from the court that they should give him some time to make his arguments. As the Gemara in Sanhedrin said in the 3rd chapter, they said every raya that you have 30 days to bring it. And the Beis Din were concerned that he was not he was just trying to bluff. So therefore they said to him, give us your notes. And he said to them, if I don't come in the next 30 days, it's going to be nullified, because he's trying to prove to the court that he's a serious person. Well, guess what happened? exactly what happened. Itnis v'lo asa. There was an onus, an accident happened. He wasn't able to come. So what happens now? So Amar Avuna batel chafasei. Avuna says, guess what? He said, if I don't come, my notes are canceled. That's it. His notes are canceled. He loses his notes. Amar le Rava. Rava says no. Rava says your notes are not canceled. Anasu. Rava says it was an accident beyond his control. He was an ones. Some say this is Rabba, some say this is Rava, but he says an anasu. The anus Rahmana Patre, and the if somebody's an onus, the Torah releases him from liability here. So this was an onus; it was beyond his control. So why do we know this? How do we know this concept? Because it says this refers to a woman, a young woman who's betrothed, and she's assaulted. So she's no longer retained her virginity, but she had been betrothed to another man at the time. So we don't hold her responsible for that action because it was an onus. It was beyond her ability to control. And so that's the source for onus Rahmana Patre, that if a person it violates something accidentally, they're not going to be liable. And says the Gemara, and if you're going to say Kitola Shani, that the case of an onus in with respect to a death penalty is different. Now, when it's an onus, when it comes to a death penalty like adultery, well, then we're going to say that you're exempt. But in this case, just a monetary matter, maybe it's a distinction, and we're not going to apply the laws of onus. But we learned nidre onsin. If you have a concept, nidre onsin, let's say you have a vow of an onus. This is our Mishnah. That this is a vow of an ones and it doesn't apply, and so too that's what Rava is saying, that in the case of an ones it doesn't apply here, and so these notes should not be nullified. Gemara says, or Rava, so according to Rava, who says this concept. According to Rabbi, who says this concept of onus, Rahmana Patre, why, if you say that the onus, the Torah cancels it, the Torah says you're not liable, why is that different from the following Mishnah, which is the Mishnah from Gittin, which we also had on the very first daf of Ksubos, that glorious daf that opens up Maseches Ksubos. Why is this different from the following Mishnah, which says, Harei zeh gitech? A person says, this is your divorce, you're divorced from this moment. If I don't come from now until the next 12 months, you're divorced from today. Today is November, I don't know what, November 21st. And the man says to his wife, you're divorced from today unless I show up sometime in the next 12 months. And then he dies sometime in the next 12 months. The Gemara tells us, the Mishnah says that this is a valid get. But Amai, according to Rava, why is it a get? So why don't we say it was an onus? Death is a pretty good excuse. He was beyond his control. He couldn't show up. So why don't we say that in this case it's an onus? So the Gemara says, Amri, that Rava would respond, Dilma Shani Asaf. Now that case is different. Why is that case different? Over there, even though there was an onus, the Aviyada Demis, min altar havas gamar v'yayiv gita. On the top of Chav Zayin on my base, there's a fundamental difference between the two cases. And in the case of the get, he wants her to be divorced. Why does he want her to be divorced if he dies? Because, as we did in all of Yevamos, he doesn't want his wife to have to fall to Yibam and marry his brother. So therefore, he wants her to be divorced. And so therefore, if he would have known that he was going to die, he would have said, you're divorced immediately from today. So therefore, indeed, it's really his intent. We do an umdana, we do a calculation that it's his intent that he would have wanted her to be divorced from today. And so therefore, in the case of the divorce, we don't say onus Rahmana Patre, but in our case, we say that this onus prevented him from doing what he wanted to do. And so therefore, we say, ones Rahmana Pacha. So the Gemara says, well, still according to Rava, why do we say an ones works? Why is this different from the following case? From a person who said, the person was giving his get to his wife. A person is giving his get to his wife. The Amrahu, and he said to the witnesses, this case, we also had the first half of Ksubos, Bezing Ksubos. He says, if I don't come sometime in the next 30 days, Gita, then my get is going to be applicable. A guy says, I'm giving you this get. It didn't say from today. This case is different. He says, if I don't come sometime in the next 30 days, then you're divorced. And then what happened? Also, the guy shows up, Upaska Ma'abra, but he missed there's a river stopping him from getting across. And he's there. He's shouting at them. He missed the boat. He literally missed the boat. Upaska Ma'abra. He missed the boat. And he couldn't get over the other side. The river stopping him from coming. He said, Chazu Da'asi. He's waving up and down. He says, I'm here. No, you're not here. You're on the other side of the river. But he's shouting, I'm here. And Amar Shmuel, Shmei Masya. Shmuel says, that's not called coming. So first of all, why is this a question on Rava from Shmuel? We could have just said Rava argues with Shmuel. The Gemara doesn't want to say that. The Gemara says, but according to Rava, why do we say that is called not coming? Why don't we say that case is different? Why don't we say that that's an onus? According to Rava, you say an onus, you're exempt. Here the guy is saying it's an onus, and it's an onus, and it's an onus. The get should not take place. And we don't say that. Shmuel says, Lo Shmei Masya, that's not called coming. Mara says, Dilma Onsa de Megalia Shani. So, Umeavram Migwe Unse. So the Gemara says there's a distinction. That's not really called an ones, because that's called an ones de Megalia. That's an onus that you could see. That's not unforeseeable. That's very foreseeable. We know there's a river there. We know there are river boats that go at 3 times a day. We know that if the boat leaves at 10 o'clock and you leave your house at 9:30, there's going to be traffic. You're not going to make the boat. So that was a foreseeable one. That's not called an onus. That's why Shmuel's saying it. Shmuel's not in disagreement with Rava. Commentaries discuss, what about if you get there and you miss the boat, but they have another boat that's really expensive? It's a first-class boat. It's a boat that charges much more money, and you don't want to pay that price. You could buy a ticket, but the ticket will be much more expensive. Is that called an onus? So that's the question. Is that called an onus? Most commentaries say that's also called an onus. It's a machokes. Another case it's a machokes is like the case of prayers. If you miss your prayer, then you do tashlumin at the next prayer. Let's say miss shachris, you do 2 mincha. Let's say, so that's only if it's an onus. But if it's not an onus, you don't get to make up. You don't get to do 2 at the next one. Let's say you wake up in the morning and you say, I have time to daven. Okay, I'm not going to daven now. I'm not going to go to the minyan at 7:10 this morning. I'm going to just daven at the 8 o'clock minyan. Then at the 8 o'clock minyan, you say, you know what? I have still time. I have another 2 hours. I'm going to daven at the 9 o'clock. Then at the 9 o'clock minyan, you say, there's a 9:30. Then at 9:30, all of a sudden you get a call. Your friend needs you there, or your child needs you there and help. So you have to run out. Is that called an onus? You had time to daven all morning. Your onus besof. You're only an onus at the end, but the whole morning you weren't an onus. So is that called an onus? So by prayer, we're lenient and we say that is an onus, even though you had the whole morning to daven, you kept pushing it off, and it's still called an onus. So the Gemara says, Rafuna, back to Rafuna, who says we don't say an onus. Rafuna says in this case we don't say it's an onus. According to Rafuna, this is what's called an asmachta. Asmachta lokanya. What's an asmachta? Asmachta is a concept we have. We have the classic sugya is in Sanhedrin about gambling. Asmachta is something where you make an agreement with somebody, but you don't really think you're going to owe the money. You think you're not going to have to owe the money. So therefore, we say asmachta is not binding because you didn't really intend to give it over. Because the case is the case of the gambling. The person thinks he's playing poker. He thinks there's no way I'm going to lose. I'm the best poker player in the world. So he doesn't really, when he puts his $100 in the pot, he doesn't fully intend to give that to the other person. And so therefore, the position that says asmachta is not binding says if you're going to take his $100 when he loses the game, it's like you're stealing from him because he didn't really intend to give you that $100. He thought he was going to win. He knew he could lose, but he didn't think he was going to win. He wasn't giving it fully over. So that's why in this case also, this person puts his notes into the court. It's an asmachta. He doesn't really intend to give up his notes, his promissory notes. So it shouldn't be binding. Asmachta l'kanya. So therefore, he shouldn't lose his notes. That's the Gemara's question on Rav Huna. So the Gemara says, well, Shani Acha, this case is different. The Metavsan Zachusan. This case is different because he already gave over his notes to the court. So in his mindset, he handed them over. So as the Mefarish says, it's like the court has already collected it, and it's not an asmachta under these cases. Gemara says, is that really the case? That if you hand it over to the court, it's like the court has collected it, and it's not an asmachta. Vatanan. Misha para miktas chovo. Let's say somebody has paid a portion of his debt. He paid Reuven borrowed money from Shimon. So Shimon has a note on Reuven. Reuven pays half the note. He pays half the note. Shimon still has the note though, but Reuven paid half of it. So we don't want to leave Shimon with the note because then he'll go and collect the full thing from Reuven. So he gives it over to a third party to hold the note until Reuven pays the rest. So what happens now? Reuven, he pays it over. And now Reuven says, he says, if I don't pay it from now until 30 days, he says to this third party, the Bank of America, he says to the Bank of America, if I don't pay Shimon back from now until 30 days, give him back the note. Give him back the note. Let's say the note came, the 30 days showed up, and he didn't pay. Rabbi Yossi Omer Yitain. Rabbi Yossi says, well, the Bank of America should give Shimon back his note. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Lo Yitain. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, Bank of America does not give back the note to Shimon. No, we don't pass like Rabbi Yossi, who says that the bank should give the note back to Shimon. Why? The law is not like Rabbi Yossi, who says that an asmachta is binding, because we don't pass him like that. We don't pass him like that. We don't say the law is like Rabbi Yossi, who says that asmachta is kanya, but the law is like Rabbi Yehuda, who says that it's an asmachta is not binding. Reuven thinks he's going to pay off the full debt before 30 days. So even though in this case the bank is holding the note, we still say it's an asmachta, and we still paskin, says Rav Nachman, that the asmachta is not binding. And so too in the case of the court, we should say it's an asmachta and it's not binding, even though the court is holding it. So why can Rav Huna say that the case is nullified, that the notes are nullified? It's an asmachta. Asmachta is not binding. So the Gemara says, Shani Hacha the Amar Levatron Zechuse. So he says, no, this case is fundamentally different, because what does he say in this case? He says that the person who deposits this notes with the court says, if I don't show up in 30 days, he says all my merits will be canceled. That basically he's waiving his rights. And that's more severe than just giving him the contract. He didn't just give him the note to hold. He actually said, I'm waiving my rights. And so therefore, since he says he's waiving his rights, that's completely, that will indeed be canceled. That's a case of mechila. In the case of mechila, we're going to say it's canceled. That's how the Rosh explains it. The others say, that since he says, if I don't come, my notes will be canceled, he's being mocha on every single koach and sus that he has in his contract. And the whole concept of mechila does not apply to an asmachta, because only the asmachta only works when he needs to give him something new. But this is a case of waiving your rights, and therefore there's no asmachta under those circumstances. So the Gemara says, what's the halacha in the end? The halacha is asmachta is kanya. We say that an asmachta is binding, and also we're also saying asmachta is binding. And secondly, we say who duo honest. When do we say an asmachta is binding? Only in a circumstance where he's not an ones. And the third idea is who de kanu minay. But bezdin chashuv, then asmachta only works when they did a kinyan, when they did a formal process of processing the transaction, and they did this in a bezdin chashuv, and they did this in a distinguished court. So that is this concept of asmachta. Okay, so anybody has any questions, we'll continue now, but I'll stop the recording. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address them.